The king's heart simply stopped when the goddess's sacred flame rose during the ritual and proclaimed Octavia Hale as his true mate. She was only an Omega, yet she fought like a beta and shone brighter than any noble would ever admit, including him, who had felt something for her since their youth, even if he hid it behind armor. But before the entire kingdom, before he could even touch her, Octavia lifted her chin, faced her own destiny, and spoke the words that shattered Arvendahl. "I reject you, my king." Humiliated, Lucian could only utter a command that echoed like a sentence. "Seize her." The sacred fire burned at the center of Arvendahl's great hall, its flames dancing in shades of silver and crimson beneath the gaze of the full moon pouring through the Gothic stained glass windows. The heat did not come from the embers, but from the very essence of the goddess manifesting that night. The crimson moon turned the sky into a cloak of blood and promises, and every wolf in the kingdom knew that beneath that reddish glow, destinies would be revealed with no room for lies or escape. Octavia Hale stood motionless along the side of the hall, wrapped in a simple gray linen dress that contrasted cruelly with the silk and velvet gowns of the noblewomen around her. Her platinum hair, almost translucent under the crimson moonlight, fell in soft waves over her shoulders. Octavia's blue eyes, clear and cold like the frozen northern lakes, were fixed on the central fire with such intensity that some nobles looked away, uneasy with the strength radiating from an Omega, who was expected to bow her head, though she never had. She felt the weight of every stare on her. The whispers were discreet, but not discreet enough for her lupine hearing to miss a single venomous word. "An Omega in the sacred ritual," they muttered. "The Hale's audacity knows no bounds. Blacksmiths and healers forgetting their place." Octavia kept her chin high, her breath steady, ignoring the tightness in her chest that threatened to transform into something larger, something dangerous. On the opposite side of the hall, standing on the black stone dais where the Draven throne had remained empty for 3 years, Lucian observed the crowd with eyes that seemed to devour every shadow, every movement, every quickened heartbeat. The Alpha King was 27 years old, yet he carried the weight of entire generations on his shoulders. His thick black hair fell to his shoulders in unruly waves, framing a sharply hewn face and a strong jaw. The ceremonial armor he wore was a deadly work of art, black as a starless night, and adorned with silver details depicting wolves poised to attack. Every piece had been forged by the kingdom's greatest artisans, including Octavia's father, though few knew that. Lucian's eyes, nearly black under that light, roamed the hall until they landed on her. And then, for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time itself, the world around them disappeared. There were no nobles, no elders, no crown or chains of hierarchy. There were only 2 wolves recognizing each other through a bond they had both spent years trying to ignore. Octavia felt his gaze like a physical touch, a brush of power that made her skin tingle and her inner wolf growl softly, restless. She knew those eyes. She knew the way he tilted his head slightly when analyzing an opponent, the almost invisible scar above his left eyebrow that she herself had caused at 13 during a training session that ended in blood and stifled laughter. She knew the sound of his breathing when he ran in wolf form through the forests, the scent of pine and iron that always clung to him, the way his hands held a sword with the same delicacy with which they would one day hold wildflowers he never offered her, though she knew he had picked them. One of the elders struck his staff 3 times against the marble floor, the sound echoing like thunder across the tense silence. Alaric Voss, the oldest of the lunar counselors, stepped toward the sacred fire with measured steps. His robe dragged across the ground. He lifted his arms, and his voice, though raspy with age, carried the power of centuries of tradition. Under the light of the crimson moon, in the presence of the goddess who shaped us from clay and blood, from howl and silence, we begin the ritual of the eternal bond. Let those whose souls were intertwined before their first breath step forward into the sacred fire. Lucian descended the dais with the predatory grace only a dominant alpha possessed. When he reached the stone circle around the fire, He turned to the crowd, and for the first time that night, his expression softened almost imperceptibly as his gaze settled on Octavia again. On the opposite side, Lauren Blackmere stepped forward, and the entire hall seemed to exhale in relief. She was the expected one, a noblewoman of pure lineage whose union would consolidate power and wealth between the houses, just as it had for previous generations, where a Draven always bonded with noble blood, and where many elders insisted that in this new reign it would be a Blackmere. Lauren possessed the refined beauty of the nobility. Her dark brown hair was arranged in an elaborate structure of braids and pearls, and the emerald green gown she wore was worth more than the entire Hale household. She smiled at Lucian with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome of the night, someone trained since childhood to become queen. But the fire did not react when she approached. The flames continued dancing in their steady rhythm, beautiful and indifferent. Alaric furrowed his brows, exchanging glances with the other elders. Lauren's mother, Lady Ophelia Blackmere, watched from the place of honor with narrowed eyes, her fingers clutching the railing tightly. Something was wrong. The ritual never failed. The goddess never made mistakes. "Step forward, all who have been called," Alaric ordered, his voice now tinged with poorly disguised urgency. That was when Octavia felt it. A pressure in her chest, an invisible pull dragging her forward, even as her feet tried to resist. Her inner wolf did not fight it. On the contrary, it sang, howled, demanded that she answer the call echoing through her blood like an ancient melody. She took one step, then another, and another. The hall fell utterly silent when they noticed her moving. The nobles recoiled as though she carried a plague, opening a reluctant path toward the sacred circle. Octavia looked at no one. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, or perhaps on the man standing on the other side of it. When she crossed the line of stones and entered the circle, the fire erupted. The flames shot upward in silver spirals that reached the vaulted ceiling, and a celestial sound filled the hall. A chant not born of human throats, but of the very essence of the moon. The crimson light intensified, bathing Octavia and Lucian in a halo that separated them from the rest of the world, and everyone saw what could not be denied. A silver thread of light stretching between them, pulsing, alive, unbreakable. The bond. Lauren stepped back, her face drained of all color. Ophelia rose abruptly, eyes wide with horror and fury. The elders exchanged incredulous looks. And Lucian stood completely still, staring at Octavia as though seeing her for the first time, and at the same time as though he had always known this moment would come. "This is an outrage," Ophelia's voice ripped through the silence. "An Omega cannot be the king's mate. It violates every law, the very structure of Arvendahl." But Alaric raised his hand, silencing her. The elder approached the fire, observing the thread of light connecting the two young wolves, and when he spoke, his voice carried reverence, and something dangerously close to fear. "The goddess has chosen. It is not for us to question her will. The bond has formed, and it is absolute." Lucian finally moved. He circled the fire, approaching Octavia with slow, almost cautious steps, as though afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. When he stopped in front of her, close enough to feel the warmth of her body, close enough to see the tiny golden flecks in her blue eyes that had always fascinated him during their teenage training sessions, he raised his hand. Not to touch her, not yet, but in a silent offering, an unspoken question echoing through the newly formed bond. Octavia looked at that hand, the hand that had wielded swords beside her, that had helped her stand after brutal falls on the training grounds, that once, just once, had brushed her fingers when no one was watching, and both had pretended it meant nothing. She could feel the bond tugging at her, begging her to accept. And then she saw her. In the far corner of the hall, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure dressed in black. Morgareth, the sorceress, advisor to the Blackmeres. Her eyes met Octavia's for a brief second, and in that glance lay the reminder of the conversation they had had 3 nights earlier, in the darkness of the Hale Forge. If you accept the bond with the king, your lineage will be cursed. Madness, plague, and death under the first full moon. Your parents, your grandmother, all Hale blood will perish in agony. Octavia had thought it was a bluff, but seeing Morgareth there, she knew. It was no bluff. It was a sentence. Octavia blinked, pushing back the tears threatening to fall. Her wolf howled in internal protest, tearing her apart from the inside, begging her not to do what she was about to do. She lifted her eyes to Lucian, and in that moment, allowed herself to feel everything she had repressed for years. The impossible love, the deep admiration, the connection that went beyond hierarchy and names. She let him see it, through the bond pulsing between them, through her eyes that had always been far too transparent. "I feel it," she whispered, so softly that only he and the nearest elders could hear. "I feel every fragment of the bond, every promise the goddess wove between us before we were even born." Lucian smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but genuine. A smile he reserved only for her, in the rare moments when the masks of King and Omega fell away, and they were simply Lucian and Octavia, 2 wolves who understood each other without words. "Then accept it," he said, his voice rough with restrained emotion. "Accept the bond, and I swear by the goddess that nothing and no one will ever make you bow again." Octavia closed her eyes. The pain ripping through her chest was physical, a crushing weight threatening to tear her apart. But when she opened them again, only cold determination remained in those blue eyes so many had underestimated. "I reject you, my king." The words left her lips firm, clear, impossible to misinterpret. And the effect was immediate and devastating. The sacred fire extinguished, as though an invisible hand had smothered it. The silver thread of light connecting them twisted, screaming silently, before shattering into 1,000 fragments that vanished into the air. A mystical roar echoed through the hall, so deep it made the stone walls tremble. Lucian staggered back as if he had taken a physical blow. His hand flew to his chest, clutching the armor over a heart that suddenly felt as though it had been torn out and shoved back and broken. He looked at her, and for the first time since he had become king, Octavia saw something in his eyes she had never imagined she would see there. Pure agony and absolute incomprehension. "Why?" The word left him as a low, dangerous growl. Octavia did not answer. She could not. If she told the truth, the curse would fall on them all anyway. If she lied, he would see straight through her. So she did the only thing left to do. She kept silent and allowed him to believe the worst. The elders erupted into protests and exclamations. Alaric shouted about blasphemy and betrayal of the goddess. Others demanded immediate punishment. Ophelia smiled, and her smile was so cruel it seemed to slice through the very moonlight. Lauren stepped closer to Lucian, placing a delicate hand on his arm in a carefully calculated gesture of comfort. But Lucian was not looking at anyone else. His eyes were fixed on Octavia, and in them there was a mixture of fury, pain, and something deeper. Something that felt like a betrayal so visceral it stole the air from his lungs. "Guards!" His voice rang through the hall, cold as ice and sharp as a blade. "Caesar!" 4 guards approached, grabbing Octavia by the arms with unnecessary force. She did not resist. She held herself straight, dignified, even as they dragged her down the marble corridors under the satisfied gazes of the nobles and the poisonous whispers that followed her like shadows. Lucian climbed back onto the dais, and when he turned to face the court, his expression was that of a king wounded in the deepest part of his pride. Let it be proclaimed throughout all of Arvendahl. The name Octavia Hale is banished from this kingdom. No wolf may speak it within the palace walls without facing my wrath. She will be taken to the Grey Lands at dawn, and should she ever return, she will face death. The silence that followed was the silence of a funeral. Octavia was dragged to the dungeons, and as she descended the stone stairs into the depths of the castle, she allowed herself a single tear. Not of regret, but of mourning for the love she had chosen to sacrifice to protect those she loved. In the cold, damp cells, Octavia spent the night watching the crimson moon through the small barred window. The goddess offered her no comfort, no explanations, only silence. And when dawn finally painted the sky in gray and pink, they set her on a horse and escorted her beyond the borders of the kingdom, to the Grey Lands, where the exiled and the forgotten built lives in the shadows of what had once been glorious. The Grey Lands had not earned their name by chance. It was not only the perpetual mist that hung over the hills like a mourning veil, nor the ashen soil where little grew beyond weeds and twisted shrubs. It was the very essence of the place, as if color itself had been drained from the world, along with the hope of everyone who ended up there. The air carried a metallic taste, mixed with the smell of wet firewood, and the poverty that had settled over those forgotten lands like a second skin. Octavia rode for 3 days before reaching the first settlement. The horse the guards had granted her was old and exhausted, with jutting ribs and dull eyes that reflected the same weariness she felt deep in her bones. When she finally dismounted at the entrance of a village whose name she did not even know, her legs trembled, and she had to lean on the animal for several long minutes before she could walk. The village was made up of perhaps 40 or 50 structures, if they could even be called that. They were more like shacks of rotting wood, thatched roofs patched with rags, walls that let the icy wind slip through every crack. People stared at Octavia with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Here in the Grey Lands, most were human, or wolves so weakened by malnutrition and despair they could barely shift. There were also a few lesser shifters, foxes and ravens, creatures who had also been exiled. "You're new here." It was not a question. The voice came from a woman who might have been 70 years old. She sat in front of one of the shacks, mending what looked like a burlap sack. "Exiled or on the run?" "Exiled," Octavia replied, her voice rougher than she intended. She had not slept properly since the night of the ritual. The woman nodded, as though she had already expected that answer. "Got a trade?" "I know how to work metal. My father is a blacksmith." A spark of interest flickered in the woman's tired eyes. "Metal? All we have here is Doran, but his hands shake so badly he can barely forge a nail. If you can do what you say, you'll have work and food. Not much, but enough to keep you alive." That was how Octavia found her first refuge in the Grey Lands, an abandoned shack on the outskirts of the village. Days turned into weeks. Octavia forged during the day, simple tools the villagers needed, knives, nails, hinges. At night, she lay on her straw mattress and listened to the distant howls of wild wolves roaming the hills. The pain of the severed bond was physical. She woke in the middle of the night with her chest burning, as if someone were driving claws into her heart. Some nights were worse, when she could feel, through the remnants of the bond, Lucian's pain echoing on the other side. He suffered too. Perhaps even more than she did, because at least Octavia knew the truth. He felt only the betrayal. Weeks turned into months. Octavia began to get to know the villagers. There was Elian, a young fox shifter with mischievous golden eyes who tried to crack jokes even when there was nothing to laugh about. Mira, the woman who had taken her in on the first day, turned out to be a former healer banished for using forbidden magic to save a child. Doran, the old blacksmith with trembling hands, told her between sips of watery beer how he had once been a master armorer in the capital until a false accusation of theft destroyed his life. Everyone in the Grey Lands had a story. Octavia listened, and with every story, a cold anger began to grow in her chest. It was not just about her and Lucian. It was about an entire system that crushed the weak and elevated the cruel. It was on a new moon night, 3 months after her arrival, that Octavia began to notice something disturbing. Groups of royal guards passed through the Grey Lands with increasing frequency, not to keep order, but to collect absurd tributes. They tore away the little the exiles had, claiming direct orders from the crown. When anyone tried to resist, the punishment was brutal and public. Octavia watched as they took half the grain harvest from a family already starving. She saw them burn down the shack of a man who refused to hand over his last coins. And she heard, from drunken guards, speaking too loudly in the village's makeshift tavern, that everything was being done in the name of King Lucian Draven, that the orders came directly from the palace. But something did not add up. Octavia had known Lucian since childhood. She had seen him share his own food with younger trainees, defend servants from unjust punishments, train endlessly not to dominate, but to protect. The man she knew would never order such cruelty against the weakest in his kingdom, unless he did not know. The suspicion began small. The guards always mentioned orders signed by counselors, never directly by the king. They spoke of Lady Ophelia Blackmere as the true voice of reason at court, of how she had convinced the king that drastic measures were necessary to strengthen the realm. Octavia started paying closer attention. She discovered that the Grey Lands were not the only ones suffering. Other territories, those far enough from the capital that the king never visited personally, were being systematically exploited. The people starved, while entire storehouses of grain were sent not to the royal army, but to private Blackmere estates. She began asking questions, discreetly. She spoke with passing merchants, discontented guards, servants who had fled the palace. And slowly, a terrifying picture began to emerge. The Blackmeres were not just influencing the court. They were systematically undermining the kingdom, building their own power in the shadows. Meanwhile, in the gilded halls of Arvendahl, Lucian Draven barely recognized the man he saw in the mirror. Months had passed since the ritual, since he had banished the only woman he had ever loved. Lucian had believed that day that he had finally been blessed by the goddess, that the impossible love he had carried in secret since adolescence had been revealed as his fated mate. But the blessing turned to torment in the same instant Octavia rejected him. He did not sleep. He could not. Every night, he lay in his chambers while the servants kept a respectful distance, and felt the absence of the bond like a phantom limb, something that should have been there, but had been brutally severed. Lauren Blackmere was always present now. After the disaster of the ritual, the council had pushed for a new union, one that would be politically solid. Lauren was beautiful, well-educated, knew exactly what to say and when to remain silent. On paper, she would make a perfect queen. But when Lucian looked at her, all he saw was the void where someone else should be. My king. Lauren approached him in the throne room, where Lucian pored over endless documents about taxes and territorial disputes. I brought the tea you are so fond of. I thought it might help with your difficult nights. Lucian accepted the cup without truly seeing her. His eyes skimmed a document about tributes from the Grey Lands, but the words would not settle in his mind. His inner wolf was restless, growling low, dissatisfied with everything. With the absence of the bond, with Lauren's presence, with the decisions the council increasingly made without consulting him. The elders asked me to remind your majesty about the betrothal, Lauren continued. It has been months. The people need stability. Hope. I will give my answer when I am ready, he replied, his voice colder than he intended. Lauren bowed gracefully and withdrew, but not before Lucian caught the flash of irritation in her eyes. She was losing patience. The Blackmeres were losing patience. And something in that realization made Lucian's wolf go on high alert. It was then that Bran Thorne, his captain of the guard and friend since childhood, entered the hall with a grim expression. We need to talk, Bran said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. In private. They withdrew to Lucian's private chambers, a room at the back of the castle where even the servants did not enter without explicit permission. Bran closed the door and activated a silence charm that prevented any sound from leaving the room. The orders being carried out in the Grey Lands and the northern villages, Bran began bluntly. They were not signed by you." Lucian frowned. "Of course not. I delegated those administrative matters to the council, as I always have. And the council is using your name to commit atrocities." Bran pulled folded parchments from his coat. "I managed to get copies of some orders. Entire families being evicted, harvests confiscated well beyond legal tribute, men imprisoned for debts they do not owe. All in your name, Lucian. The people think you are the one ordering this." Lucian took the documents, and the more he read, the more his fury grew. These were not administrative measures. They were systematic exploitation. Organized cruelty. Who is signing these orders? The elders, Lady Ophelia, her son, Silas Blackmere. Bran hesitated. "Lucian, the Blackmeres are building a private army. Small for now, but growing. They control the moon silver trade. They have monopolized the northern routes. They are positioning themselves. For what?" But Lucian already knew the answer. To seize power. To turn him into a puppet king, or worse, replace him entirely. "You need to act," Bran pressed, "but carefully. They have the support of the elders, of most of the nobility. If you confront them openly now, I will be seen as an unstable king, still shaken by the rejection at the ritual," Lucian finished bitterly, questioning the sensible decisions of seasoned advisors. Bran nodded. "We need more concrete proof, and allies. Start investigating quietly," he ordered. "I want to know exactly what the Blackmeres are doing and who else is involved. And Bran, if you hear anything about her—" He did not need to finish the sentence. Bran knew his friend well enough to understand. "Octavia is alive in the Greylands," Bran said softly. "She works as a blacksmith in a small village. She keeps out of trouble. That is all I know." Lucian closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of weakness. She was alive. She was safe. It was not enough. It would never be. But it was something. Back in the Greylands, Octavia was working at the forge when she felt it. A presence that should not have been there, ancient and powerful, watching her from the shadows between the shacks. She lifted her gaze from the blade she was sharpening and scanned the evening light. The mist was thicker than usual, swirling in patterns that were not natural. And then she saw her. A figure emerging from the fog as though made of it. An old woman, but not a fragile one. Her hair was white, braided in intricate patterns that Octavia vaguely recognized as ancient symbols of protection. Her eyes were such a pale blue they seemed silver, the exact same shade as Octavia's. The old woman approached without a sound, her bare feet barely touching the muddy ground. She stopped a few steps from the forge, studying Octavia with an intensity that made the young wolf feel completely exposed. "You must return, daughter of the moon." Her voice was deep, resonant, carrying echoes that did not come only from a human throat. "The kingdom bleeds, and your name has been stolen." Octavia slowly set the hammer aside, every muscle taut. "Who are you?" The woman did not answer directly. Instead, she reached out and touched Octavia's arm. The contact was brief, but enough to make visions explode in the young woman's mind. She saw burning fields, crying children, guards wearing Arvendahl's crest as they stole and killed. She saw Lucian on his throne, surrounded by advisors whispering poison into his ears. And she saw something else, a truth buried so long it had become myth. A bloodline, a name that should have died but survived, hidden among blacksmiths and healers. When the old woman withdrew her hand, Octavia was breathless, bracing herself on the anvil so she would not collapse. "Not everything you were told is true," the woman went on, and now her voice carried something that sounded like sorrow. "The blood that runs in you belongs to the house that cursed the throne itself. Go back, and you will find not only the king, but your past." Before Octavia could ask any questions, the old woman dropped something on the ground. A silver medallion, larger than a coin, engraved with crests Octavia knew all too well, the Blackmere symbols, but split in half, as if the stone itself had been cut by a blade. "What does this mean?" Octavia asked. But when she lifted her gaze, the woman was gone. Only the mist remained, swirling in silent eddies. Octavia picked up the medallion, feeling the metal pulse against her skin, warm and alive. There was magic in it, old and powerful. The Blackmeres. Her name was tied to the Blackmeres somehow. But how? Why? In the days that followed, the restlessness grew until it became unbearable. Octavia could not stop thinking about the medallion, the old woman's words, the visions that had been planted in her mind. She began asking more direct questions of the oldest exiles, those who had come from Arvendahl decades earlier. It was Mira who finally gave her the first real clue. "There is a blacksmith in the mountains," she said one night as they shared a thin stew by the common fire. "He lives alone, never comes down to the village. They say he was someone important before exile, someone with noble blood. What is his name? No one knows. He does not give one." Mira hesitated, then added, "But he looks like you." That was enough. 3 days later, Octavia left before dawn, following the vague directions on how to find the forge in the mountains. When she finally found the forge, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Octavia stopped at the entrance, watching the figure working inside. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, marked by decades of hard labor. His hair was gray, nearly white, tied back in a low tail. But when he turned, sensing her presence, the man let the hammer fall. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Octavia saw a succession of emotions cross his face. Shock, recognition, and then something that looked like pain and relief so tightly bound together, it was almost unbearable to witness. You have her eyes," he murmured, his voice hoarse, as though it had not been used in a very long time. Octavia took a step forward, her heart pounding so hard it felt ready to burst from her chest. "Whose?" "Marielle's." The name meant nothing to Octavia, but the way he said it, with such reverence and hurt, made something twist inside her. The man moved closer slowly, as if afraid she might disappear. His large, calloused hands trembled slightly when he raised them, but he stopped before touching her, respecting her space. "I am Leoric Blackmere," he said at last, and the surname dropped between them like a bomb. "Your father." The world seemed to tilt under Octavia's feet. She stepped back, shaking her head, denying what she had just heard. "That is impossible. My parents are the Hales, blacksmiths. They have raised me since I was a baby. And they loved you as a true daughter," Leoric said, his voice breaking. "I bless them for it every day. Without them, you would have died the same night you were born." He gestured toward the inside of the forge. "Come in, please." Inside the forge, surrounded by the heat of the coals and the comforting smell of metal and charcoal, Octavia sat on a bench while Leoric prepared tea. His hands still trembled, and she realized it was not from age, but from contained emotion. "Marielle was my wife," he began, staring into the furnace flames as if he could see the past dancing there. "The most beautiful woman who ever lived, not only in looks, but in spirit. She had this same silver hair, these same eyes that carry the moon. She was noble by birth, but her heart bled for the weak. When she became pregnant with you, it was the happiest day of my life, but it was also the beginning of the end." Leoric paused, pain etched into every line of his face. "My sister Ophelia saw your birth as a threat. She was always obsessed with power, ruled the house even while our father still lived. When Mariel became pregnant, Ophelia went to Morgareth, the witch of the East. The name made Octavia shiver. The same witch who had cursed her. Morgareth had a vision," Leoric continued, his voice growing tighter. She said that a child born under the crimson moon, with pure Blackmere blood and silver eyes, would be chosen by the goddess to join with the throne, and that this union would destroy the power the Blackmeres had amassed through generations of political manipulation. Octavia swallowed hard. So she decided to kill me. She decided to kill all of us. Leoric closed his eyes. On the night you were born, under the crimson moon, Ophelia sent her private guards. Marielle tried to flee with you. I fought to buy her time, killed several guards, but there were too many. I heard your crying, and then silence. I thought they had killed you too. Tears streamed down the aging blacksmith's face. But Marielle was more clever than I ever imagined. Before dying of her wounds, she hid you in the Hale's basket. They were blacksmiths in our service, good and humble people. She knew they would raise you far from the Blackmere curse. And you? Octavia asked, her voice barely audible. How did you survive? I faked my death. Ophelia and Morgareth made a grand show of burning my remains. But what they burned was a body I stole from a dead mercenary. He gave a bitter smile. I fled here, to the mountains. Lived in hiding, forging in secret, always waiting for the day I might see the daughter I lost on that bloody night. Octavia covered her face with her hands, feeling tears burn her eyes. The Hales had never told her because they likely did not know the whole story, or because they feared for her safety. So I am a Blackmere, she whispered, from the house that cursed me, the house that is destroying the kingdom. You are the true heir, Leoric corrected firmly. Marielle's blood was the purest of the noble lines. You are the rightful lady of House Blackmere, not Lauren, not Ophelia. The goddess chose you not only as the king's mate, but as the one meant to restore balance. He knelt before her, taking her hands with reverence. Ophelia cursed your bloodline to force you to reject the bond. She knew that if you joined with Lucian, the entire corrupt empire she built would fall. The goddess does not allow evil to thrive near her chosen ones. But I rejected the bond to save my family, Octavia protested. The Hales. The curse. It was already broken the moment you spoke. Leoric's voice was gentle but unwavering. Morgareth is powerful, but not more than the goddess. When you rejected the king, you prevented the curse from fully taking hold. Your family is safe. The kingdom is not. He took from around his neck a medallion identical to the one Octavia carried, the other half of the broken crest. When he joined the two pieces, the seal shone with a pure silver light, and a soft sound filled the forge, a chant that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the sound of the ancestral wolves, of the ancient packs that had forged Arvendahl in the mists of time. It was the voice of the goddess, confirming what Leoric had said. Go, Octavia, her father whispered, squeezing her hands tightly. Go and show those who humiliated you who you truly are. Show the goddess that your mother's innocent blood was not spilled in vain. Save the kingdom she loved. Save the king the goddess destined for you. Octavia looked down at the reunited crest, glowing in her hands. She felt the weight of the truth, the weight of responsibility. But she also felt something else. Anger, righteous and burning. For her mother, who died protecting her. For her father, forced to live in the shadows. For all the families destroyed by Blackmere greed. For Lucian, manipulated and used as a puppet. We will need proof, she said, and her voice now carried the authority of someone who had finally understood her place in the world. And witnesses. Leoric smiled, and for the first time since she arrived, there was true hope in his smile. I have both. There are others who survived that night. Servants loyal to your mother who witnessed Ophelia's crimes and were forced into exile. I gathered them over the years, kept them hidden, waiting. Waiting for what? For you, daughter. We have always been waiting for you. The full moon rose over the mountains of the Grey Lands 3 nights later, bathing Leoric's forge in a silver light that seemed to bless the preparations taking place there. Octavia was no longer alone. Over the last few days, her father had summoned those he had kept hidden for more than 2 decades, living witnesses to the crimes the Blackmeres had committed and buried under lies. There was Celine, who had been Marielle's lady-in-waiting, and had witnessed Ophelia conspiring with Morgareth on the night of the massacre. Her hair, once black, was now completely white, turned so not by age, but by the trauma of watching her lady die. There was also Thaddeus, a loyal guard who had refused to kill an innocent child and paid for it with deep scars carved from the top of his face to the bottom, left for dead, but surviving out of sheer stubbornness. And there were others, each carrying fragments of the truth that, together, formed a devastating mosaic of betrayal and murder. Octavia spent those 3 nights listening to every story, memorizing every detail, feeling her anger grow and shift into cold resolve. Her father worked without rest at the forge, not crafting weapons, but restoring something he had hidden for years. The true Blackmere crest, not the corrupted symbol Ophelia wore, but the original, etched in pure moon silver, mined from the sacred mountains themselves. When your mother died, I managed to save this, Leoric explained, polishing the metal until it shone like a piece of captured moonlight. It is the symbol of the true bloodline, blessed by the goddess when the Blackmeres were still guardians, not predators. When you wear it before the court, every wolf will feel its authenticity. There is no way to counterfeit a lunar blessing. On the night before their departure, Octavia stood alone at the forge entrance, watching the stars and trying to calm the storm of emotions in her chest. Fear. Yes, there was fear. But there was also something stronger, an unshakable certainty that this was what she had been born for. Not to bow and serve, but to rise and fight. She sensed her father's presence behind her before she heard him. Your mother used to stand like this, Leoric said softly, coming to stand at her side. Staring at the stars before making important decisions. She used to say the goddess spoke through starlight to those who knew how to listen. What would she say now? Octavia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leoric was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. She would say she is proud of the woman you have become. She would say love is worth fighting for, even when the whole world conspires against it, and she would tell you to trust the goddess, because she never abandons her daughters. Octavia felt tears burn her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Not yet. There would be time for tears later, when everything was over. For now, she needed to be strong. Tomorrow, we change Arvendahl's fate, she said, and there was steel in her voice. One way or another. The journey back to the kingdom took 5 days. They traveled discreetly, avoiding the main roads, using hunters' tracks and forgotten paths that only exiles knew. Octavia rode at the front, the restored crest hidden beneath her dark cloak, the reunited medallion hanging at her neck. Leoric rode beside her, disguised in simple traveler's clothes and a hood that hid his time-worn features. The witnesses followed behind, each one in disguise, each one carrying not only their own pain, but the hope that justice would finally be done. As they neared the capital, the devastation became more and more evident. Villages Octavia remembered as prosperous in her youth were now little more than empty shells. Fields that should have been lush with crops lay brown and abandoned. The people they passed on the roads had hollow eyes and bodies far too thin, faces marked by hunger and despair. This is what the Blackmeres have done, Celine murmured beside Octavia as they rode past a village where children with bellies swollen from malnutrition played in the mud. They bled the kingdom until only husks remained. Octavia tightened her grip on the reins so hard her knuckles turned white. Every scene of suffering fed the fire burning inside her, not blind vengeance, but necessary justice. They reached the outskirts of the capital on the eve of the royal wedding. News had spread quickly, whispered by merchants and travelers. King Lucian Draven had finally yielded to the council's pressure and would marry Lady Lauren Blackmere in a grand ceremony meant to cement the noble house's hold over the kingdom. The entire aristocracy was present, all the pack lords, all the important houses. It would be the event of the century, and it would also be the perfect stage for the truth to finally come to light. Octavia and her group blended in with the servants pouring in to work the banquet. There were so many people entering and leaving the palace that it was relatively easy to go unnoticed, especially for those used to being invisible. The nobles never really paid attention to the faces of those who served them, and that arrogant blindness would be their downfall. Inside the palace, every step felt like a knife to Octavia. She knew these corridors, these halls. She had raced through them as a child, escaping angry tutors. She had trained in the courtyards where guards now marched, preparing for the ceremony. And she had dreamed, in her most secret adolescent fantasies, of one day walking through those doors not as a servant, but as something more. The irony was so cruel it was almost laughable. They hid in a storage room in the lower levels of the castle, a forgotten place where old weapons and unused armor gathered dust. There, they waited for night to fall, and the final preparations to begin. Octavia used those tense hours to prepare herself mentally. "Are you ready?" Leoric asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I am," she answered, and she believed it with every fiber of her being. The great hall of Arvendahl had never looked more magnificent. Thousands of candles lit the space, their flames reflected in stained glass that told the story of the wolves from creation onward. Garlands of white flowers, rare and costly, were twined around the marble columns. The tables groaned under the weight of enough food to feed an entire village for months, while outside the palace walls, people starved. The nobles were all present, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, laughing and drinking as if the world were not collapsing around them. The elders occupied their places of honor, with Alaric Voss at the center, his ceremonial robe so white it almost hurt to look at. And on the main throne, Lucian Draven watched everything with eyes that had lost their light. He wore the full armor of a king, but Octavia, watching from the shadows near the servants' entrance, saw only a broken man desperately trying to hold himself together. Lucian looked different, exhausted, as if the weight of ruling alone, without the bond that should have sustained him, had been eating him alive from the inside. His gaze swept the hall without truly seeing anything, and when it briefly flicked toward where Octavia stood hidden, she felt such a sharp pain in her chest that she had to lean against the wall to keep from stumbling. The bond. Even shattered, even rejected, there were still fragments of it, echoes whispering through the emptiness where the full connection should have been. She felt his pain, his crushing loneliness, the sensation of drowning in a sea of responsibilities with no anchor. Hold on a little longer, she thought, as if he could hear her through those fragile remnants. Just a little longer. Lauren Blackmere entered then, and the entire hall sighed in admiration. She was stunning, there was no denying it. The white gown flowed around her like water, embroidered with pearls and silver threads that caught the candlelight. At Lauren's side, Ophelia walked with the bearing of someone who already saw herself as the true ruler. She wore emerald green, the traditional Blackmere color. Her smile was as sharp as a blade, and her eyes swept the hall with the satisfaction of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. The elders began the ceremony. Alaric spoke the traditional words about union, strength, and the continuation of the bloodline. Lauren stepped closer to Lucian, extending her delicate hand to him. And the king, moving like an automaton, began to lift his own hand to accept it. That was when the hall doors opened. Not with violence, but with a solemnity that made the sound echo like thunder in the silence that followed. Every eye turned to the entrance, and what they saw drove the air from the room. Octavia walked down the central aisle slowly, each step measured, every movement deliberate. The candlelight seemed to gravitate toward her, making her silver hair gleam like liquid metal. Her blue eyes catch and reflect the light, until they seemed almost luminous. Behind her, Leoric walked with his hood shadowing part of his face. The witnesses followed in a line, each one carrying the weight of their own story. The hall erupted in murmurs. Some recognized Octavia, the banished Omega whose name could not be spoken. "Who dares interrupt the sacred union ceremony?" Alaric thundered, striking his staff against the floor with enough force to silence the whispers. Octavia stopped in the center of the hall. She pulled back the hood that partially hid her face, and the movement revealed not only her features, but the crest she wore over her heart. The symbol glowed under the candlelight, and every wolf in the hall felt, viscerally, the power emanating from it. It was ancient, pure, unquestionable. "I am Octavia," she said, and her voice carried through the hall without any need to shout. There was command in that tone, an authority born not of rank, but of truth. "Daughter of Mariel, Blackmere, and Leoric, rightful heir of this house, I have come to demand that the truth be spoken before the goddess and before the entire kingdom." The silence that followed was that of a world holding its breath. Then, like glass shattering, everything erupted. Nobles leapt to their feet, shouting. Some demanded she be arrested at once. Others, especially the older ones who remembered Marielle, looked from Octavia to the crest with expressions of shock and growing recognition. The elders exchanged frantic glances, unable to decide whether they should intervene or allow this to continue. But the strongest reaction came from Ophelia. She rose so abruptly her chair crashed backward with a loud bang. Her face, usually so controlled, was twisted into a mask of fury, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Lies!" Her voice cracked through the air like a whip. "My brother is dead. This woman is an imposter, a desperate Omega trying to cling to a bloodline that is not hers." Leoric stepped forward, pushing his hood all the way back and letting the candlelight fall over his face. The entire hall gasped. There was no denying it, no looking away. That was Leoric Blackmere, older now, marked by time and exile, but unmistakably alive. "Dead men do not bleed, sister," he said, and there was so much weight in those words they fell like stones. "But the living can testify. They can speak truths you buried under 23 years of lies and blood." Ophelia took a step back, and for the first time since Octavia could remember, the Blackmere matriarch actually seemed shaken. But she was far too seasoned, had survived too many political wars to fall that easily. Witnesses can be bought. "Stories can be fabricated," she shot back, regaining part of her composure. "Where is the real proof? Where is anything beyond words and a crest any skilled blacksmith could have forged? And you are not my brother. My brother is dead." That was when Celine stepped forward. The former lady-in-waiting had tears streaming down her face, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I was there that night. I saw Lady Marielle running through the corridors with the baby in her arms. I saw the guards you sent after her. I heard her screams when they caught her." She pointed a trembling hand at Ophelia. "And I heard you, Lady Ophelia, telling Morgareth not to leave a single witness alive. But I lived. I hid in the kitchens between the wine barrels, and I heard everything." Thaddeus came next, the scars on his face looking even deeper under the dramatic candlelight. "I was a guard of House Blackmere. I received direct orders from Lady Ophelia to kill a newborn child. When I refused, she herself took a dagger and cut me, saying I would be an example to anyone who dared question her commands." He turned his head, revealing the marks that ran from his forehead to his chin. "These scars are the seal of her cruelty." Then someone no one expected stepped forward. It was Elian, the young fox shifter from the Grey Lands, his golden eyes now serious, stripped of any hint of the usual lightness he carried. He held a yellowed, stained piece of parchment in his hands. "I am from the Grey Lands." His voice was firmer than his thin body suggested. "I watched my family and my neighbors be destroyed. This parchment," He lifted it for all to see. Bears the royal seal. It says that by order of King Lucian Draven, half of our winter harvest was to be seized. When we tried to explain we would not have enough food to survive the cold, the guards burned our cabin. They said it was the king's order to punish anyone who questioned the crown. He took a few steps toward the throne, his eyes locking on Lucian. But it was not you, was it? You never gave that order. You never knew entire villages were starving while Blackmere granaries overflowed with grain. You never knew they were using your name, your seal, your authority to turn your people into ghosts. One by one, the witnesses came forward. Each told their part of the story. Each added another piece to the horrible puzzle taking shape before everyone's eyes. And as they spoke, Octavia watched Lucian. The king had risen from the throne and was slowly descending the steps. His gaze was fixed on her, and there were so many emotions passing through those dark eyes it was impossible to name them all. Shock, recognition, confusion, pain, and beneath it all, like embers that had never truly gone out, something that looked dangerously like hope. When he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that the shards of their broken bond began to throb and burn, he spoke in a rough voice. You let me believe you rejected me by choice. You let me think that what we felt, that what the goddess confirmed, meant nothing to you. Octavia met his eyes, finally allowing herself to be vulnerable, finally letting him see past the defenses she had built. Morgareth came to me 3 days before the ritual. She said that if I accepted the bond, my family would be cursed. Madness, plague, and death under the first full moon. I could not let the people who raised me, who loved me, suffer for something I did. So you sacrificed me. I sacrificed the happiness of 2 to save the lives of many. Her voice cracked. But never, not for a single second, was it because I felt nothing for you. And I am not just talking about the bond. I have always wanted you. The silence that followed was so charged with emotion that even the most cynical nobles seemed reluctant to break it. But then the Alpha King spoke, his voice carrying unquestionable authority. Ophelia Blackmere, and all those who conspired to corrupt my kingdom and destroy what the goddess blessed, you are under arrest for treason against the crown, for the murder of noble blood, and for crimes against the moon goddess herself. He turned to the elders. Alaric, convene a formal trial. I want every crime recorded, every witness heard. And I want the truth proclaimed in every town, every village, every corner of Arvendahl. There will be no more lies in my kingdom. The guards advanced toward Ophelia, but before they could reach her, she threw her head back and laughed. It was a high, almost deranged sound that made the hair on everyone's arms stand on end. You think it is that easy? She spat, her eyes locked on Lucian. You think I spent decades building power just to fall without a fight? The shift was brutal and fast. Ophelia lunged forward, her body twisting, bones snapping, skin giving way to fur. In seconds, a massive, feral she-wolf stood where the Blackmere matriarch had been. Her eyes glowed red, not with the goddess's power, but with something darker, tainted by Morgareth's magic. And she was not alone. All around the hall, about a dozen nobles loyal to the Blackmeres began to shift as well. Wolves, all of them, larger and more vicious than they ever should have been, their bodies swollen and warped by the dark magic Morgareth had been weaving into their veins for years. It was a private army, kept as a last resort, prepared for this exact moment. "Kill the king!" Ophelia howled, her voice carrying even in wolf form. "And the bastard who dares call herself Blackmere!" The hall erupted into chaos. The sound of transformations echoed from every side, bones cracking, snarls tearing from throats, the musky scent of wolves filling the air. The guards loyal to Lucian did not hesitate, their own shifts beginning instantly. Within seconds, the great hall that had once hosted elegant ceremonies was a battlefield of wolves. Lucian exploded into his lupine form with a force that made the floor tremble. Where a man had stood moments before, a colossal black wolf now towered, easily twice the size of any other in the hall. His coat was dark as a moonless night, muscles rolling beneath his fur with raw power. His eyes burned with an intense gold, carrying the absolute authority of an alpha king. When he roared, the sound was so deep, so primal, that even the corrupted wolves hesitated for a fraction of a second. Leoric shifted as well, his wolf a silver gray, still imposing, old scars visible even through his fur. He took position beside the witnesses he had brought, shielding them as the battle unfolded. The corrupted wolves attacked in formation, but the royal guard was well trained. Brown, gray, and mottled wolves formed a defensive wall, meeting the assault with military precision. The hall filled with the sounds of growls, yelps, and bodies slamming into each other. From the shadows at the back of the hall, Morgareth emerged, her eyes glowing with profane power. She raised her arms, and a wave of black energy shot toward Lucian, trying to paralyze him, to drain his strength. Before the magic could reach the king, there was an explosion of silver light. Octavia's transformation was unlike any of the others. It was not brutal or violent. It was like watching the moon descend to earth. Her body flowed between forms with supernatural grace, and when the shift completed, a wolf stood where she had been, a wolf as white as untouched snow. She was not as massive as Lucian, but there was something about her that made every other wolf instinctively fear. Her eyes glowed with silver light, the very essence of the moon captured in lupine form. The crest she wore over her human heart now shone through her white fur, visible like a ghostly mark over her chest. When she moved, it was as if the light itself followed her. The white wolf shot toward Morgareth with impossible speed. The sorceress tried to hurl her dark magic at the new threat, but the moment her spells touched the light radiating from Octavia, they dissolved like smoke. "Impossible!" Morgareth screamed, stumbling back. "No wolf can—" But Octavia was not just any wolf. She was of pure lineage, a direct descendant of the first Blackmeres blessed by the goddess herself. That power had slept in her bloodline for generations, waiting for someone worthy of carrying it. And now, faced with the threat that sought to destroy everything the goddess had blessed, that power awakened fully. The white wolf leapt, and when her paws struck the ground before Morgareth, a circle of silver light exploded outward. The sorceress was trapped at its center, unable to move, her dark magic straining against the moonlight, but failing. Now, Octavia's voice echoed. With the source of the magic immobilized, the corrupted wolves began to weaken. Their bodies were still enhanced, but the connection feeding them had been severed. And Lucian, the Alpha King, saw his opening. The black wolf moved with a speed that defied his massive size. He was upon Ophelia before she could react, before she could even attempt to flee. His jaws closed around her, dominating her completely. It was the grip of a supreme alpha, asserting absolute dominance, forcing submission. Ophelia tried to fight, but it was useless. Lucian's raw power was overwhelming. He forced her to the ground, holding her pinned beneath a weight that seemed impossible to resist. His growl was low, continuous, heavy with authority that could not be challenged. One by one, the other corrupted wolves stopped fighting. Some were subdued by the royal guard. Others, sensing their leader's utter defeat and the severing of their source of power, simply lay down in submission. The battle that had begun so violently ended in total domination. In a far corner of the hall, amid the chaos, Lauren Blackmere slipped quietly toward a side door, her torn wedding gown dragging over the floor. No one stopped her. No one pursued. She vanished into the palace shadows, and then into the night beyond the walls, fleeing from a fate she had never truly controlled. The light surrounding Morgareth pulsed once more, and then the sorceress collapsed to her knees. "It is over," the white wolf's voice echoed. Slowly, the transformations began to reverse. The wolves of the royal guard returned to human form, panting but victorious. The corrupted wolves were forced back as well, collapsing naked and exhausted, the dark magic finally purged from their systems. Lucian was the last to transform. He kept Ophelia restrained, now human and trembling, his hand on her neck, not squeezing, but making it clear that any attempt to escape would be futile. Octavia shifted back with the same fluid grace, the silver glow fading until only a young woman remained, breathing hard but standing tall. The crest over her heart had stopped shining, but everyone who witnessed her power would remember it forever. Ophelia Blackmere. Lucian's voice echoed through the ruined hall, cold as ice. You have not only committed treason. You attacked your king, attempted to murder your rightful heir, and corrupted nobles with forbidden magic. But you will not die. You will live, exactly as those you trampled lived, stripped of power, of title, of everything except the weight of your own actions. He handed her to the guards, and Ophelia, finally broken, did not resist. Her eyes swept the hall one last time, seeking Lauren, but her daughter was gone. Morgareth was dragged out shortly after. When the hall finally fell quiet, when the wounded were tended and the last traitors imprisoned, Octavia and Lucian stood side by side in the wreckage, surrounded by cracked columns and stained marble, but victorious. Leoric approached his daughter, pride shining in his eyes. Your mother would have been so proud, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lucian turned to Octavia, and for the first time since the battle began, he allowed himself to feel the delayed terror of how close they had come to losing everything. He pulled her into his arms, not caring who watched, not caring for protocol or decorum. You saved me, he whispered against her hair. Again. We saved each other, she replied, holding him just as tightly. In that moment, the shattered fragments of their bond began to pulse, recognizing one another, trying to reconnect across the rift the rejection had created. The goddess has given us a second chance, Lucian murmured, threading his fingers through hers. He knelt before her, right there in the center of the great hall of Arvendahl, under the eyes of all who remained. A king kneeling, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of something greater than pride or hierarchy. Octavia Blackmere, daughter of Marielle and Leoric, rightful heir, chosen of the moon goddess. His voice was firm but thick with emotion. Do you accept to rebuild the bond that was broken? Do you accept to walk beside me as my queen and my mate? Octavia looked at him, at the man she had loved long before she understood what love was, at the king who needed her as much as she needed him. She felt the bond throbbing between them, begging to be restored, to become whole again. Yes, she whispered, then louder, for all to hear. Yes, my king. The bond surged to life, not as before, gradual and uncertain, but all at once, complete and absolute. And when they kissed, it was as if the entire world exhaled in relief. It was a kiss that carried months of suffering, years of repressed love, decades of destiny fighting to be fulfilled. It was everything that should have happened on the night of the crimson moon, but which cruelty and fear had denied them. The wolves present howled, not in pain or war, but in celebration. The sound echoed through the palace corridors, spilled out the windows, and reached the city beyond the walls. And throughout Arvendahl, wolves of every pack felt the shift in the air, the promise that better days had begun. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Octavia rested her forehead against his. We have a great deal of work ahead, she said, a kingdom to rebuild. Alaric stepped forward among the rubble, leaning heavily on his staff. He looked around the great hall, the cracked columns, the stained marble, the shattered glass, and then at the couple standing at the center of it all. The goddess has curious ways of revealing her will, he said, with a weary trace of humor in his voice. But no one can deny what we witnessed today. Octavia Blackmere, true heir, bearer of the lunar blessing. Lucian Draven, Alpha King. You were tested in ways no pair should ever be, and you triumphed not through strength alone, but through truth. He struck his staff 3 times against the fractured floor. Let it be known, this union is blessed by the goddess, sealed in battle, proven through sacrifice. Let no earthly or celestial power dare separate you again. And in the mountains surrounding Arvendahl, wolves of every pack howled, sensing through the collective bond that something fundamental had shifted. The corruption that had poisoned the kingdom for decades had finally been purged. The truth had finally prevailed. And at the center of it all, 2 souls the moon had always known belonged to one another were finally, unquestionably, united.